I'm delighted to invite to the stage Mr. Shivshankar Menon, former National Security Advisor, Mr. Husain Haqqani, former Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States of America, and Mr. Andrew Small, writer, to discuss Asian Century. Does it have to be India versus China? Please also welcome Mr. Narayan Lakshman, Associate Editor, The Hindu, who will moderate the session.
So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session at the Hindu Huddle 2018 on Asian Century. Does it have to be India versus China? My name is Narayan Lakshman, Associate Editor at the Hindu, and I am honored to present our esteemed panelists here. Firstly, Mr. Husain Haqqani, who is a former ambassador from Pakistan in America and currently with the Hudson Institute. Mr. Andrew Small, who is with the German Marshall Fund US and an expert on, well, anything to do with China policy, US, China, China, Pakistan. He's written a book and so on. So he's the expert in that field. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Shivshankar Menon, former National Security Advisor for India and Foreign Secretary. So thank you very much for being here. Obviously, this is a very complex, sort of multi-dimensional relationship between India and China. But let's start maybe with, the more immediate specificities of the relationship, looking at the Doklam crisis. Now, do you think that we are going to continue seeing more such choke points, such difficulties, pinpricks in the relationship along the border? Because obviously there's been a history, and recent reports suggest that even what we saw at Doklam in terms of resolution is not actually panned out. There are new satellite images that raise some concern about, the presence of Chinese troops and so on.
Well, I don't want to get into the specifics because I don't know. I mean, I left government 4 years ago, and it seems to me that both sides showed at Doklam that they didn't want this to escalate, that they actually handled it peacefully between themselves. And I think most commentary seems to miss that basic point, that like previous such crises where we've had face-offs from the late 70s onwards, whether it was Sundarungchu, Wangdong in 86, Depsang in 2013, I mean, there's been a series, Chumar, we've always managed to actually disengage because we do have a regime in place on the border, but we do have places which both sides consider on their side of the line. So we will have face-offs, we will have future cases, but as long as we know how to handle it and we see a common interest in handling it peacefully, as I keep saying, this is actually our most peaceful border. If you look at it, compare it to all our other borders, there hasn't been a death on this border since 1975, and that was by accident in the fog when somebody got shot. So I don't think we need to blow Doklam up into something that, in fact, the salience of the border, of the boundary in the relationship today is much less than it's ever been in the past. So for me, because I think the question we were asked originally is, does it have to be India versus China? I think Doklam is actually proof that if we can manage our differences, it doesn't have to be India versus China.
But I guess in one sense, it did gain a lot of traction in the public debate here, and certainly I take your point that there was a peaceful resolution.
No, it differed from previous crises in two respects. One is it wasn't Indian territory. It's Bhutanese territory, in our opinion, and in Bhutanese opinion. And the other was that we did what we've always done, which is deal with it quietly, bring force in where you need to, but then talk to them and say, restore the status quo. We're ready to discuss any other issues once the status quo is restored, which happened ultimately. But for the first time, there was a lot of Chinese publicity and some very threatening articles, a lot of commentary on the Chinese side, which suggests a changed Chinese pattern of behavior not so much on our side, but on their side. And I think that's the cause for anxiety. Nobody's quite sure why, what has changed. But is that because it's Bhutanese territory and not Indian? We'll have to see. I think it's too early to say. But I see it as part of a longer continuum of our learning how to manage our differences and actually doing so successfully. But that doesn't mean there will never be any incidents in the future. In fact, I think it's almost certain given the situation.
And speaking of sort of a more noticeably belligerent, sort of at least rhetorical position on the part of China, do you think, Andrew, that what we've heard vis-a-vis the Maldives crisis, is that something that to you it marks a change in attitude, a change in position in Beijing fundamentally?
Not yet on the Maldives. I think the stakes there are still lower for China than they are along the border. I mean, to deal with the border issue briefly, but before the Maldives, I mean, I think the Chinese were embarrassed by what happened there, and they were embarrassed in a few different ways. They were politically unprepared for it. They had not anticipated the Indian response. They were militarily poorly prepared for it. I think the PLA now internally are going through a sort of review process. What do we have to do differently? And the bluster, the public rhetoric and things, in the end didn't work. If there was to be, if the view was that by escalating rhetoric that China had not really done in the past, that this would elicit a different response, it failed. And all of this played out at a very, very politically delicate time for the Chinese in the run-up to Party Congress. So I think what's been going on since then has really been some reflections on what they need to do differently. And some of that is, as you've already seen, how should they be prepared better militarily if there is a future contingency along similar lines? How do they anticipate these things better? But I think there is a sense in China that the border is never just about the border. It's also about the broader state of the relationship and the relationship as a whole. I think there is a sense that the sort of downward drift in the relationship that there's been in the last couple of years in particular probably needs to be addressed. Now, I think you have countervailing impulses on the Chinese side. You have some who want to figure out some sort of a different settlement. You have other voices on the Chinese side who say, we need to teach India a lesson. We need to react militarily at a future point of our choosing in a situation where we have the advantage, which was not the case with Doklam. And I think both of those impulses are going to coexist. And you see these different voices still playing out in various areas of their policy in South Asia. And you see that with the Maldives, certainly. You do see these more assertive, aggressive voices that I think had not really been there in the same way in the past as much in South Asia. But I think the salience of the region to China in various ways has gone up, and it's pulled into play various actors who were not really as actively involved in the region before.
Okay. Thanks, Andrew. And Mr. Haqqani, what is, in your view, just sort of segueing from what Andrew said, what is, in your view, the role of a third country, such as, well, you're looking at the Pakistan-US relationship, or the China-Pakistan relationship? What sort of pressure does that put either on China to act vis-a-vis India, or India indeed to take other actions?
Well, I could answer that question, but I won't.
Okay.
In fact, I'll pose a bigger question, because if we are huddling together, we should be looking at the big picture rather than just the daily news. So Doklam is like in the news right now, and then what Pakistan and China might be doing is in the news. There's a bigger question, and the bigger question is, what is China's long game? And what could or should be India's long game? And here are some basic realities. The basic reality is that between them, China and India have about 40% of the world's population. Both have growing economies, but China now accounts for almost 15% of the world's GDP. India accounts for about 3%, so China is 5 times larger at this moment. Both are old civilizations, and both were essentially, historically, inward-looking. So, for example, the competition was within the region. So, among Chinese princes, in case of India, among Indian princes, neither one of them established colonies abroad, sent conquerors abroad. The Cholas were the only ones who went farther than the subcontinent. What we are going to see in the future, however, is something different. Communism has changed China. It has made China more internationalist. Even when they have changed their economy somewhat or significantly from communist principles, they are not going to stop being internationalist. That's why they are they have a military base or a base in Djibouti. That's why they are eyeing Gwadar on the not far from the Persian Gulf. And one of my colleagues at Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., Michael Pillsbury, has written a book called The 100-Year Marathon, in which he makes the point that the Chinese always take a very long view. And their long view, he says, is exemplified by something they play. It's a board game called Wei Qi. And in that board game, basically, that can be translated as the encirclement board. So they try to, it's about how to encircle others, your rival, and then not be encircled by them and make it impossible for them to encircle you. And I think that the Chinese have already started playing that game, realizing that the United States may not necessarily be as overwhelmingly powerful as it was, but they don't want to provoke the United States until they have reached that point where they think they can encircle everybody and be the world's leaders. The economy favors them. Militarily, they are not there. And so they are looking at a longer-term game. And in the long term, India and China will end up as rivals for the simple reason that India has the manpower that China has. India's manpower will be younger than China's. The median age of China is going to be 37 by 2020. India's is going to be 24, 25, something like that. But India has other problems. India has a human capital problem. India has not invested in its military modernization as much as China is slowly doing. And it is not going to be India's decision whether India will be China's rival. In a contest between, or in a choice between democratic and totalitarian states, it's always the totalitarian state that decides who is the adversary. It was the Soviet Union that made the United States into an adversary after having been an ally in the Second World War. It was the Ottoman Empire that made the British their rivals in the beginning of the First World War, even though the British wanted to be their cooperative. So my thought is that we need to rise above the day-to-day and understand the bigger global forces at work. And in that context, Pakistan and its leaders have looked at the global contest and they have cast their lot with China. And that is because the Pakistani military elite has always thought of India as the permanent enemy or the eternal enemy, something that I have been always very critical about. The United States is trying to do with India what the British did with the United States at the end of the Second World War. Say, hey, we are a little weaker at this moment. You can rise up to the plate. So in case of the Indo-Pacific, the US would really like India to step up to the plate and make sure that China does not have free rein and become the ascendant hegemon in this region without any competition. So India has some decisions to make which I feel have not been fully made because the view is still, in my opinion, a little 20 years behind. Not understanding the longer game of the Chinese and being focused only on the day-to-day rather than having a long-term plan. How do we go from where our economy is to be able to have the economic potential to compete if the competition comes about? Look, nobody wants to fight. So if there's going to be no fight, there's going to be no problem, fine. But if there's going to be a competition, you have to have the capacity and the capability for that competition. And right now, China outspends India almost 2.5 times more in the defense sphere. And similarly, the economic gap is much bigger than it ought to be. And so if India can also think in the long term, if China can think about a 100-year plan, maybe India needs a 50-year, 30-year plan as well.
So, just on that planning question, I just wanted to ask Mr. Menon. So, do you feel, even from your own experience, the roles you've been in, that there's a qualitative difference between the way, China is approaching policy across, he spoke of encirclement across the region and the way that India is doing it, because in one sense, that sets it apart.
I think if you turn the argument around and look at it slightly differently, China is in a crowded neighborhood, 14 neighbors, 2 friends, out of the 14. Pakistan, North Korea. And North Korea, So why is China global? Partly because of her economic interests. She needs the energy, she needs the raw materials, she needs the access to markets. But she has to get beyond her periphery. It's the same thing has happened to you in India. If you look at you in the last 30 years, thanks to what you've done at home, your relative balance of power has improved against every other country in the world except China. Now that's a big change. And I don't think we quite understand this. But look at the difference. When you started reform in 1990, 91, less than 18% of your GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, it was 49.3% of GDP. Think of that. That's almost half your GDP is external merchandise trade. You have no choice but to engage with the rest of the world. At that time, in 1991, more than half that trade of your trade went west to Suez and so on. Now more than half goes east. So suddenly freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is an Indian interest, which it wasn't originally. Your definition of your interest has expanded, so has China's. And so you've got a situation where you will compete in the periphery, and you have been competing. And it's not just an India-China issue. Because it's in this periphery, you have new friends in the periphery. You have Japan, you have Vietnam, you work with so many other friends, with Korea, with other friends. And you will do this. So for me, it's not going to be, it's India versus China. It's going to be India will cooperate with China where she can. She will compete with China as she has been doing. And it's going to be a much more complicated interplay than just a bilateral sort of India versus China.
So let me ask you this, Andrew. So from what Mr. Menon was saying about, say our trade, the direction of our trade has caused us to emphasize different parts of the world maybe over time. Do you feel there's a divergence between what business, private sector, people-to-people contacts has required of India, which is say look east or act east, but maybe policy-wise or strategy-wise, we're maybe not changing enough in say how we deal with the South China Sea. So questions like Vietnam, is government policy doing what the private sector behavior seems to be pushing us towards to make it smoother?
I mean, the private sector is around the world at the moment, actually, is very mixed views on this. Certainly there are companies that are looking east to China, but there are substantial barriers for them to actually make money there. The Chinese market's extremely closed, and actually the conditions there are worsening. I mean, if you look at a number of take the US-China policy debate as well. The business community there was really one of the underpinning forces of engagement, cooperation and things. That's gone. They may not stand up in public and say it, but actually what they're looking for from government at the moment is a much more robust stance on a lot of issues, because the conditions internally in China on this are hardening, whether it comes to technology transfer, whether it comes to how these companies are now able to compete in home regions. I mean, if you look in Europe, you suddenly find sectors that were supposed to be the industries of the future, where the Chinese are now either they're acquiring robotics companies, they're acquiring artificial intelligence companies. The US is going through a major review of its CFIUS procedure specifically to deal with this, the investment review process. So I think for the business sector at the moment, in many ways it's quite a turning point when it comes to the thinking about China. I think there's a real question that's underway right now as to China in the WTO. I mean, some people have even come out and said that it was a mistake to have Chinese accession. I mean, at the extreme end of things. But certainly that the trade, that the mechanisms for dealing with a non-market economy like China are inadequate. So looking at it on commercial trade terms, I don't think there's a sort of clear and clean impetus right now that says others should be, getting on board with this sort of inevitable economic rise and things like that. I think there's a huge concern about what direction China is taking, particularly under Xi Jinping, where I think there's a real reassertion of the party state. Even the private sector in China is now operating much more heavily under the control of the party than was the case before.
Okay. And do you see that change, Mr. Haqqani, in terms of China's internal politics? Do you see that as in any way affecting its relationship with Pakistan and the region from flowing out of that?
I mean, look,
Under Xi Jinping?
the China-Pakistan relationship is a long-term relationship. I mean, the Chinese decided a long time ago that having a cooperative or friendly Pakistan is useful in tying down India. So if Pakistan and India have their problems unresolved, 400,000 or so Indian troops will forever be engaged with Pakistan. I call this the strategy of having a secondary deterrent. How do you keep everybody tied down? North Korea. I mean, what does China get from North Korea? What it gets from North Korea is a threat for Japan and South Korea. So South Korea and Japan are forever worried about North Korea and cannot start focusing on China directly. Although Prime Minister Abe, to his credit, has been articulating a vision for a longer-term management of China's rise. Now, in all such situations, if China does not fulfill the worst fears that people like me have, fine, there's no problem, everything's okay. But you don't want to be caught unprepared for when they do. In case of India, you already have that experience. You had the experience of the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai phase, and then came 1962. And you were caught with a situation where your troops did not have the kind of boots that they needed to be able to survive in the Himalayan winter facing Chinese troops. So all I am saying is that instead of continuously focusing, and this is a weakness, in a lot of discussion of India-China that I'm seeing, that it's all about like a very short-term view and very simplistic. So are they going to be competitors? They don't need to be competitors, they'll be friends. Okay, so because we have hope that they can have a cooperative relationship, therefore we should not be prepared for competition. That is not the way it should be looked at. The bigger forces at work in the global sphere should be seen, and it should be understood that China, A, has muscle, and B, is willing to flex that muscle, especially under Xi Jinping. And thirdly, the economic rise of China has enabled it to have the wherewithal that will enable China to start thinking in terms of a strategic dominance and strategic domination that it may not have thought before. And in that, Pakistan, from China's point of view, and I'm speaking here as a Pakistani, Pakistan is just a pawn for China in that game. They're not thinking the best for the people of Pakistan. They're thinking how to use Pakistan to keep a potential rival at bay. And they could do that with other countries as well. So if they interfere in the Maldives, they're not doing it for the betterment of the people of the Maldives. If they were trying to play a role in Sri Lanka, they weren't doing it for the people of Sri Lanka or for Sri Lanka as a state. They were doing it primarily to use everybody. And when you use others, you basically protect yourself from having to do it yourself. So that is what needs to be confronted. And I think Prime Minister Modi has taken the necessary steps to try and create the relationships that are needed. But then once those relationships are created with Australia, with Japan, with South Korea, with the United States, it has to be developed into a security architecture for the Indo-Pacific. And India has to start changing its outlook from its old, non-aligned, all is going to be well and everybody is going to be nice kind of attitude to, okay, what if everybody is not nice, especially China, and what do we do with it when the moment comes?
Okay, but
let me add to this big picture. I think the problem is that if you look at the world today, it's multipolar economically. I mean, China already accounts for, as you said, almost 17% of world GDP. If you add that to the Indian GDP share, actually almost a quarter of the world's GDP, it comes out of these two countries. But it's multipolar economically. Militarily, the US is still predominant. And frankly, is the only power which has the ability to operate anywhere it wants around the globe. China doesn't have that capability yet and is unlikely to either catch up with the US or reach that capability very soon. So she's not a global superpower in that sense at all. She's a global economic superpower. Politically, the US has today become transactional and is no longer interested in running the world order under Trump. So you have a situation which is thoroughly confused politically. Now, is this so bad from our point of view? No, because you're not a status quo power. You didn't like the old system. You want to change this. This creates opportunities for you. You have new friends. You have the possibility of working with others. And frankly, I wouldn't be so scared of, oh, here's a Chinese world coming. Yes, there are people who write books called, When China Rules the World. But there are also people who write books saying When China Crashes, The Great Fall of China, etc. I don't subscribe to either of these. What you can do here is to maximize your own interest. And your interest is in an Asia-Pacific which is open. You spoke of an open and actually a security system. For me, the security issues are actually easier to deal with. You have the world's greatest trading powers in this region, in the Asia-Pacific. We have a common interest in freedom of navigation, in security of the sea lanes. So maritime security is something you should actually be working on together. Terrorism. These are not issues that actually divide you. They actually unite you. So for me, that's not the problem. The problem is the economics of it.
Yeah,
and the use of economics for political purposes.
Sure.
Now, how long can you do that? I mean, China lost $1 trillion out of her $4 trillion of reserves in 1 year in 2016 and had to clamp down on capital exports. Immediately, the ability to actually go out, money, yes, you can use it up to a point, but if you start building projects which have no return through the Belt and Road and so on, how long are you going to sustain it? So I am less worried about this prospect of, oh, what are we going to do? This is the future. The future, frankly, for me, looks confused, looks difficult, but also full of opportunity as a result.
Look, the thing about money is that, of course, having money does not solve everything. But not having money is a huge problem. And that applies in this whole situation. China's economic advantage is a great advantage. And very frankly, yes, they don't have the military wherewithal that America does, and America's advantage is going to be there for a fairly long time. But it all comes down to understanding and reading China's intentions. And if they have the resources, then they have a kind of depth in terms of being able to change and reallocate resources. So those resources can be reallocated relatively quickly. And the other side has to start thinking of it instead of saying, look, every time somebody says there is a potential problem and there is a potential opportunity, the people who are highlighting the problem are not worrying and not asking you to worry. They are asking you to think and plan. And so the planning that is needed right now is the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific China's idea? Under Xi Jinping, it doesn't seem to be. And if it isn't China's idea to have a free and open Indo-Pacific, then those like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, and like India, those who and the United States who are interested in a free and open Indo-Pacific must start working towards it in a methodical manner. And if that happens, then a lot of little things will fall into place. Now, terrorism, for example, one of the actors, a very significant actor in terrorism, is China's greatest buddy, and China protects it in every forum where others try to isolate it or try to marginalize it. And I'm deliberately not taking the name of that country. And some strategy has to be evolved whereby China, which will eventually have to bear consequences of Islamist terror itself, because it will reach Xinjiang and it will reach the Hui Muslim population far beyond Xinjiang. And so people have to think about it. That's all I'm saying. Otherwise, you and I, Mr. Menon, agree on most of the analytical framework of this.
One last quick question to Andrew, and then I'll throw it open to question. Andrew, so in this regard, my sense is also that China is doing a lot of little things across the region. It is not. Yes, obviously you have its economic might to deal with and so on, but it's like this old analogy of a frog in water which is slowly boiling, and then one day you suddenly at the end of the process you find it's boiling hot. So do you think though that in terms of say India and the US sort of maybe strategically coming together, as I think the US is interested in that, would that help to sort of actually rebalance the way you approach many of these small problems in the region? Because right now that doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, I think what's actually gone on over the last couple of years there's been a waking up to the sense that it's not necessarily primarily a military challenge with China. It is a military challenge, but these strategic economic issues are achieving substantially greater salience. The challenge from China in the neighborhood is precisely the sorts of issues that President Nasheed was talking about yesterday, what you see in Sri Lanka, these sorts of cases. And that needs a different response, and it's not necessarily the same kinds of countries that are involved in that. Certainly India, the US, Australia, the kind of Quad countries are important to that, but that was originally conceived, I think, more through a security prism. If you look at the countries that are the central economic powers, I think there you are now starting to see a much more significant role for Japan, for instance, which I think has been very fast out of the traps actually in seeing what was coming from the Chinese side and responding to it with an array of different means. I mean, there are real resources being put behind it. There's a clearly differentiated offer being put to countries. Countries don't want to be dependent on China either. They're often going to China because there isn't a good alternative. I think what's happened in the last couple of years, and it's still early days yet, is there's been more of an awareness of the fact that these options need to be given. And the options need to be backed up with actual resources. I mean, it is possible to go through and militarily and politically put pressure on countries and enforce red lines. That's possible regardless of the economic piece, and we've seen that in a couple of instances. But really there needs to be an offer, and the US has, of course, undermined its capacity to do this with the approach on trade that the new administration is taking, pulling out of TPP, kind of stepping away from the idea that you need to construct a broader economic architecture that is attractive to countries. But nonetheless, I think at least what you have with the new administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, even if it's described by some as the Belt and Road without money, and that's still the problem. I mean, the need to be commitments behind this to make these offers useful to countries, but that's going to involve the Europeans, it's going to involve the Japanese, there's going to be kind of overlapping constellations of countries. It's not going to be a single architecture. I don't think one should be overly wedded to something like the Quad, say. I mean, I think there's going to be different groupings of countries that can address some of these strategic economic issues. And between actually the kinds of countries that we're talking about, the resources are there. The resources are actually there to provide good offers for countries that, in lots of cases, they want to be able to balance. They want to be able to have autonomy. They want to be able to have freedom of choice and maneuver. In some cases, that does mean they will take advantage of Chinese resources coming in. There are countries in this region that will, of course, look to use China as a kind of counterbalancing mechanism and to provide themselves with more leverage. In Central Asia, you have countries that want leverage from China against Russia. Even in the EU, there are countries like Hungary or Greece that see taking some Chinese money as giving them a little bit of extra leverage vis-a-vis Brussels, even when the resources available from the European side absolutely dwarf what the Chinese are going in. So this is going to play out. I think one does need to be able to provide a good alternative economic offer, but I think we're moving. This is the zone that China wants to play on. This is the zone where China has been deriving the greatest advantage, and this is where the security benefits may come further down the line if they are able to hollow out countries' political capacities, if they are able to create debt traps and all of these sorts of things. So I think these are the immediate issues that need to be addressed, I think even more so than some of these longer-term questions of bases and things like that, where I think we're still a little way away from seeing that really translating into very active effect.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick point. China has a totalitarian political system. And the totalitarian political system will have two consequences that everybody has to include in their calculus. One is, of course, that their decision-making is not going to be transparent. And second, they are not going to play by the rules. So whether it's environmental degradation, which we all have to be concerned about, the chances that the Indian Supreme Court will interfere and say, hey, you can't do this because of environmental degradation are far greater than in China's case. There will be no restrictions. So the impact on the environment that China ends up creating will be far greater and with no recourse to restrictions. Secondly, when they do decide to arm and to militarize, if they decide that, then it's going to be much faster and it's going to be not necessarily visible. So that is the reason why the democracies have to prepare themselves much better than they have done so far. And I agree that people would like autonomy in decision making, smaller countries in particular. But I think the smaller countries also need to be aware of the fact that China's approach may be very lucrative and attractive in the beginning, but we have already seen Sri Lanka's debt trap, and Pakistan probably is the next one that's going to fall into that debt trap. Only today, $500 million have been lent to Pakistan, and so they will end up having all these loans that they will have to then service. And when they can't, then what will happen? Why is China willing to put so much money into these creating these debt traps if it has no intention of taking advantage of it later? No one lends money endlessly and there are bankers in the audience who are smiling. No one lends money endlessly unless they have some return. So either the return is going to be economic or the return is going to be strategic. And I think ignoring the strategic return that China expects comes at our own peril.
Absolutely, great point to it. But let's start with questions, Mr. Rao.
Somebody who's tried to follow India-China relations for a long period.
Mike.
As somebody who has tried to follow India-China relations over a long period, my sense is that it's best to treat China as a given, not just China as a given, but the rise of China, the rise and rise of China as a given. And I think India acted smartly. Shankar made a very important point about how peaceful the actual line of control has been, the boundary has been. But certainly since December of 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi made that historic visit, and both agreed to mainly on non-use of force to alter the status quo along the line of actual control. That was the formulation, and that was formalized later. Prime Minister Vajpayee and every government has done that. Trade, China is India's largest trade partner. Two-way trade is about $70 billion. Sometimes the US overtakes it. So I think the most sensible way is to cut out all this paranoia, the excessive overinterpretation of what is happening, and treat it as a given, which is actually the policy that Shankar, as I understand it, Shankar Menon as UN's ambassador, foreign secretary, national security advisor probably did. I don't want to overinterpret we put words in his mouth, but I think this has been sensible. So let's not get into any traps, some strategic affairs traps and so on in the neighborhood with various countries, in particular the United States.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about it, and I think some of our commentators in the media, as well as the strategic affairs community, have done a great disservice by distorting the perceptions of where, I'm not talking just about China, where this relationship has gone.
Let me just add a quick question to what Mr. Ram said.
May I say something to that?
Okay.
Because I think the problem in the discourse now is that we treat India-China relations as a T20 match. Every ball has to be either a wicket or a six, nothing less so. So it's this binary, we're doomed to failure, we're doomed to conflict, or, oh, there's nothing wrong, don't worry, everything's fine. Both are wrong.
Treat it as a test series.
But my own Well, more than that. I mean, let's play every year and see where we improve. But for me, the problem is really that we had a modus vivendi with China, which was worked out during the Rajiv Gandhi visit, which was a fairly simple one. We'll keep the peace on the border, we'll discuss it, all our differences, we will cooperate where we can, like trade and so on, won't let the border prevent us from cooperating, and we'll look around the world and see where we work together, which we did in the WTO on climate change, etc. But that modus vivendi has broken down. You can see multiple signs of stress, whether it's the NSG, whether it's, South China Sea, China objects to what we do, whether it's China's presence in our periphery, which bothers us. And you can list, you have this long list of issues in the last 3 or 4 years, which shows stress. So you need a new modus vivendi, because our own definition, we've changed, China's changed, the world around us has changed, and our definition of our interests has grown, as India as well, and for China. It's a new China, it's a new India. So you need a new modus vivendi. Can you do one? I think it's hard to say today. But the effort itself is worth making, because you will have this kind of complicated relationship where you compete, you have differences, but you also work together. And frankly, there are examples, for instance, Colombo Port. The last 2 expansions built with Chinese money by Chinese companies, 83% of what goes through that port is to and from India. In other words, you get the use of a facility that the Chinese have built, and you're benefiting out of it. Now, for me, that's a good example. There's a bad example right next to it in Hambantota, which the Chinese built. The port has no potential use. Sri Lankans couldn't pay back the loan. They've just transferred ownership. They've converted that into equity. The Chinese now own the port. It's still empty. And as far as I can see, the only way they can ever justify it is by using it for the Navy, because that doesn't need an internal rate of return. That's a bad example. So something that's open, commercial, where you can compete straight, use, for me, that's the way to go in the future. But there are certainly doubts about some parts of it, and those are the kinds of things you need to sort out between yourself. Manage your differences, respect each other's core interests, and see where your new problems are. And unless you do that exercise with the Chinese, you're heading for trouble.
I'd be interested to know if any of you think of any sort of modus vivendi or anything that the two countries could come together on, looking at the positive side to,
Well, this is why I said maritime security. Frankly, you have a common interest. Terrorism is something in which you have a common interest, but you need to sit down and explore it and go through this. So on the security side, you can actually think of a whole host of issues where there are things where you cannot do without each other, where you actually need each other, and you can. It's the economic issues which are much tougher. And when you see BRI projects like Gwadar, like the base in Djibouti, like Hambantota, obviously it causes you concern. And the Chinese need to start addressing that. When you see a Chinese, 30,000 Chinese in Pakistan, and what you're now told, over $60 billion worth of investment in Pakistan, you see a Chinese stake actually in the Pakistani occupation of parts of Kashmir, which didn't exist before. So those are the kinds of things that you need to actually address in the relationship with China, not only with China, but in your own thinking and planning.
A very quick comment is that the Rajiv Gandhi understanding, going back to 1988, how much of it is actually a difference between China under Jiang Zemin and China under Xi Jinping? Things have changed. China's outlook, the last party Congress, some of the things that were said. I think China's outlook has changed, and I think.
But so has ours. But so has India. I mean, don't forget, India's interest and outlooks have changed. So has China's. I don't think mind reading is not the point here. What is India's interest, from my point of view? Our interest is to transform India. Does it make sense for you if your main job is to make India a modern, strong, prosperous country? Does it make sense for you to seek confrontation with China? I mean, that's the simple question. If not, find a modus vivendi and get a life. Go and do the things that are important to you.
Andrew, do you want to chip in?
I think Xi Jinping's role and what's gone on in the last few years can be, in one way, underplayed. We're used to dealing with China as a sort of monolith. Here's the party. It's got these long-term interests, these sorts of things. In fact, there's been very significant shifts in the last period of time that are actually creating a lot more tensions than were there before.
Can you tell us a bit about what's
Externally
happening inside?
I mean, fundamentally, some of these long-term bets that countries made on China that were, there will be an economic reform process that will ultimately play out. China will become a market economy in time. That was the deal that China made when it joined the WTO. That was the promise. In a sense that even though you have a repressive state, there was a sort of advance in freedoms for people in certain important respects, economically, even in various ways politically. And if you were to compare the life of an average Chinese in the late 90s versus a few years ago, I think you could still list 10 important ways in which they would say, they're free to travel abroad, they can express themselves more freely on the internet. I mean, there were avenues opening up. That's squeezed back. Certainly you've had a trajectory even before Xi Jinping that was greater assertiveness internationally, nationalist trends, all of these sorts of things. But you've also had a view from Xi Jinping that is the party state needs to reassert itself. Even this concept that was there for some time of a degree of separation between the party and the state is gone. And these are very significant changes in terms of the entities that one interacts with in the Chinese, on the Chinese side, the degree to which you have a central agenda that's prosecuted, even the ideological elements of what China's doing abroad. It looks very different. Xi Jinping came in and said, the party is weak, the party's being hollowed out by corruption, we're in danger of losing our hold on China. And they've gone through and very systematically attempted to regain control. The economic goals have been subordinated to the political goals, all of these sorts of things. And so it is a different China that one is dealing with, not just because of its advanced power position, growing economy, these sorts of things. It's also a very different China that one is dealing with politically, and in its particularly, I think, in some of this played out internally, and people looked at it and said, this is on a continuum with what was there before. What you've seen then internationally with, abducting booksellers and attempting to shut down speech in universities, publishers outside China. There's more of an attempt to assert an ideological presence overseas, and that really wasn't there in that way before. It's not just because China's more powerful, it's also because of the agenda that's being prosecuted at the top.
Okay,
I think the big change is in the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping started talking of China as a model for the rest of the world. We haven't heard that since Mao Zedong was exporting revolution. And that's a big change in mindset, that other countries should follow the Chinese way. Of course, they translate in different ways, as model or way and so on. But the moment China sees herself as an exporter of a way of life, of how you run your economy, of how you order your politics, that's a huge shift. And that happened last year publicly at the highest level. So I think we need to, now you have two competing visions of what you have America, the city on the hill for everybody, and China. But that's not the choice anybody else wants to make. Most other countries don't want to have to choose between these two. They would rather play both off against each other and go their own way.
Okay, we're running quite short on time, so I'll take two questions together. Yeah, you sir. Yeah.
Good afternoon. Okay. Do you think China should openly adopt pro-North Korea policy than the subtlety? And secondly, do you think OBOR will manage to reshape global trade?
Sorry, what is the second question?
The first?
First one is, should China openly adopt pro-North Korea policy than the subtlety? And secondly, will OBOR manage to reshape global trade?
One belt, one road. So you want to take that?
Actually,
there's very little time. We'll just take two more questions.
The first question on the North Korea thing.
I didn't understand the first question.
Yeah. Okay, could you quickly repeat your question?
Should China?
Should China adopt a pro-North Korea policy openly?
Pro-North Korea policy.
Pro-North Korea.
Ask the Korean ambassador.
Yeah. Okay, and yes, sir. We'll take three questions.
One question, sir, regarding Arunachal.
Can they just ask theirs? We'll get yours as well.
Yeah. Welcome to India's Garden City, Mr. Husain and Andrew, and President Mohammad Azid. So my question is to our colleague, esteemed colleague Shivshankar Menon. Sir, who you think could help us to build bridges across China? The Pakistanis did for the Nixon team. Who is the right person? Is Mr. Putin, or who are you, the batch of your own IFS officers? Who is the right people to build the bridge? We want allow the neighbors. We want friendship.
Okay. Sorry, sir. We just have literally a minute. Let's get one more question in. The gentleman over there. Yeah, we'll get them as well.
Thank you. I wanted to take issue with Ambassador Haqqani on a particular theoretical point, but also then connect it to the India-China issue.
So if you could keep it very short, we have like a minute or two left.
The assumption that totalitarian regimes or dictatorships always initiate this factor of decide who's your enemy is not historically correct in both the case of the US-Soviet relationship and in the British-Ottoman relationship. And why I could dilate upon it, but I won't. But in terms of the India-China thing, and I've said this long time ago when I used to be in New Delhi in the early 70s, that who we choose to be our principal rival and enemy will determine what we consider to be our real status in the world. If we focus on Pakistan, which at the most is an irritant, maybe even a major irritant, but does not have the wherewithal to compete with us, we are dragging ourselves down to Pakistan's level. If we define China as the major threat and potential enemy, so we have the incentive to rise to the level of China.
Okay. There are lots. There's North Korea. There's One Belt, One Road. You can just pick.
Well, about who do we need as intermediary? We don't need anyone. We're quite capable of dealing directly with the Chinese. We have multiple channels of communication. I don't think we need somebody else to do our business for us anymore. I think we're not children anymore. But I actually agree with the gentleman, but for the last 10 years, our strategic focus has been China. In fact, that's something that we've done in this century at least. And I think that's the benchmark against we measure ourselves, whether it's economic performance, whether it's the accumulation of hard power, in every which way. I think that is, but as Enram said, we take the rise of China as given. We deal with the consequences, we see how we deal with it, and do it in our interest, and see how we go. I didn't understand the question on North Korea, frankly, because for me, China's policy is pro-North Korea. So I'm not sure how much more you expect them to do for North Korea.
We'll just skip each of you, if you can just share your final thoughts with us, that'll be great.
Okay, briefly on that. I mean, the North Korea case in one way illustrates one of the biggest strategic disadvantages that China has, which is its friends and allies are not a particularly great group. It's still, when you look at the constellation of other countries that is competing with China, China, paired bilaterally with anyone, looks competitive in a certain way. When you look at the broader networks of friendships, alliances, and structures, China's position looks more vulnerable, and they're aware of this. North Korea is one of the countries that, in theory, China has a pro-North Korean policy. In theory, China has an alliance with North Korea. In practice, they're absolutely sick of them. I mean, Kim Jong-un won't meet with the Chinese. They can barely communicate with them. It's turned into a strategic liability for China. They're not necessarily willing to take the steps that would be required to coerce the North Koreans, including economically, into taking the steps that would be required. But, I mean, they're kind of throwing up their hands at the same time. And yes, there are some advantages in having a strategic buffer and these sorts of things. But it's limited, and it's still the weakness that I think China has in this respect, that in some of the cases, the countries that should provide it with means of power projection are in many ways kind of a motley crew.
Thank you.
I agree with your assertion about the choices you make about your adversary determining how you will end up. So if you look at a smaller country as your adversary, you're bringing yourself down. And if you're looking at somebody who's big, you're actually raising your profile and your level in terms of your strategic thinking. As far as your first comment is concerned about us having a major disagreement over historical interpretation of the role of totalitarian and authoritarian governments making the choice effectively, I think you could dilate on it for hours, and so could I, but we don't just have the time here. We should just agree to disagree on that.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Mays. Thank my three panelists. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Shivshankar Menon, Mr. Husain Haqqani, Mr. Andrew Small, and Narayan Lakshman. I request Narayan Lakshman to present mementos to our guests as a token of our appreciation. This is the print of the first editorial of The Hindu.